The hidden costs of innovation, from telescopes to microscopes. How do images of exoplanets light years away affect microscopes that we can use to look at tiny individual molecules? What's the biggest mistake that you've made in your job, and has it affected 11,000 flights? There are tiny little details that compound over time and a cost we have to manage as people doing the innovation. In today's episode, we dive into it to look at all of the different angles from science, technology, and education. This is as good as we're going to look, I think. So we might as well just
roll with it.
Roll with it.
Doesn't get any better than this.
That's the thing with a video podcast.
We're about to switch to audio only.
Well, that used to be the game when podcasts first launched, and you would do it from your garage with your buddy. And so that was the golden age. And
no one cares what you look like. Face for radio.
That's how they invited a lot of celebrities onto these podcasts, because you didn't need to do a whole wardrobe and makeup team. But now,
I like the idea of it.
Yes, but now the celebrities all need a big entourage to pick out the outfits, because all the biggest podcasts have a video base as well. And so we're launching right into that space, although we're obviously not a very big So if it's your first time here, this is Crossover Connections, our podcast about science, technology, and education, how everything's connected. My name is Jack Wang. I'm a scientist and microbiologist. And with me, my co-host is Amanda.
Hello. Thanks for having me back, Jack.
Amanda, again, because we're introducing ourselves to our audiences every single week, you can't assume anyone is a return listener just yet. That's very presumptuous. Can you give us a brief overview on who you are and what you do?
I have a PhD in cell biology, and I currently work as a manager of clinical research.
Terrific. And between the two of us, Amanda's background is in cell biology.
That's right.
My background is in microbiology. So we have the biologies kind of sorted, which is a huge statement. Biology is way too big a field for any two individuals.
A huge overstatement.
Have it sorted. But the running title of this, other than our overall title of the podcast, is It's Not My Field. It's not exactly my area, or hey, that's not really in my wheelhouse, because the purpose of this podcast is not for us to really talk about exactly what we do and the things we work on. That's kind of, at least to me, quite boring to talk about my spare time.
Depends on the situation.
The focus of this is really to go out there and find articles about things we have no idea about, or have a little bit of knowledge about, but not enough contextual understanding. And that really helps us become more effective communicators of science in our day-to-day jobs. At least that's the intent.
I don't know about you, Jack, but I've had situations where I've been chatting to strangers at the bus stop or something along the likes, and they'll bring up some science news that they've read recently, and I'll have no idea about it, and I feel really stupid because they expect me to have some kind of comment on these things, and if I'm not up to date on the latest news, they're going, who are you? Thought you were a scientist. Why don't you know anything about this?
It's not the latest research paper in your field that they think you need to know.
No.
It's the latest news article about something trivial that they think all the scientists must clearly know about it.
Yeah.
But it's a really huge mystery as to how any piece of scientific work becomes obvious in the mainstream media. It's really a strange process.
A lot comes through media releases. For example, one of the laboratories might have published a very interesting article that's quite relevant to the field, quite exciting in the medical research field. We have a team who will formulate a media release in collaboration with the scientists, because we want to make sure that the statements are all correct, because as we know, things can sometimes get overhyped by the media, and once it's given the okay, they'll often release it to multiple press outlets who may then pick up the story. They may then come and film or conduct their own interview with the scientists who are doing the work.
It's a very top-down approach you've described, very hierarchical. You have to basically make the breakthrough discovery first to have any chance of going direct to the media.
That's right.
And you're vetted and cross-checked and fact-checked.
Absolutely.
And anything that you say to the general public basically needs to be filtered out for any obvious inaccuracies before you have any chance of communicating it, right?
That's correct. And I think it's reassuring to have that process in place. Peer review is obviously a process where your work, when you submit it to a journal, is vetted by other science experts within the field who give critical comments. They check the consistency of the work, whether the conclusions can stand based on the experimental findings, and just basically it's a rigorous review process.
The science that most people hear about that comes through official media releases, you could have a certain amount of confidence in its accuracy because of all the vetting that has happened. That's not how most people hear about their science. Most people hear about their science via social media in this current day and age.
That's true.
And as you say, some of those are not even published in any kind of sphere. Theories or findings, or in some cases conspiracies, they get way more coverage on those platforms than media releases that we typically go through. Right?
Yep.
So hopefully you can see that it's a huge opportunity for a lot of people to get into the space, but also a huge risk for scientists to venture into talking about science more casually without all that vetting that an institution with media releases would typically provide. How nervous are you feeling about being dragged onto this podcast by me? Because I'm out there, I'm talking about science all the time. I don't think you do that
I'm not,
consistently.
no.
And so what are you risking by being on this platform?
My reputation.
Your reputation, your professional scientific reputation.
My integrity.
Your time, your downtime. Clearly, you're risking your downtime.
My downtime.
Your downtime. And I think that's the real opportunity lost for young scientists, because there is so much to lose. You say one wrong thing about the wrong topic at the wrong time, and everyone thinks you're either a propagandist for some official government, or you're a fraud, you're a hack. It's very easy to tarnish yourself. But the way that scientific communication works, it's iterative. It has to be a dialogue. It's not dogmatic. It's not monologue and tell you everything you need to know, full stop. Knowledge is built upon iteration, upon constantly going back to investigate and test things.
Reviewing, retesting. Is that hypothesis still correct?
And the way that scientists talk to each other, or I guess just academics more broadly, but in our areas that we know science, it's not at all vetted, right? Like we talk to each other at conferences, no one vets that. No one vets that. And it has to be messy for it to get to the point where we can distill it into a version that is meaningful and manageable. Anyway, a lot is happening in this space that is not ideal from the scientific perspective.
You'll hear a lot of scientists speak, and they won't be conclusive in what they're saying. This may indicate this suggests that it's not ever a be-all and end-all statement. They get targeted for that. You can't say for certain, what do you mean? Don't you know? That's not the case. All we're doing is working on the best conclusions we can make at the time with the available evidence that we have.
And I also think scientists are not great jury witnesses, because we like to temper our explanations with, well, this would be correct 80% of the time. And the jury's like, what do you mean 80%
What do you
of the
mean
time?
80%?
There's only one case here. Like, is this the 80 or the 20%? So this is the whole disparity in communication. And communication is very much a discipline unto itself. That people go and do official decades worth of communication training. The scientists do decades of scientific training, which is the antithesis of communicating to a lot of different people. There's an art to it. There's also a rigor and a validity to it. And it's something that we hope to better hone through this podcast, just between me and you. But hopefully also raise the awareness and visibility among younger scientists that you have to put in the reps. You have to really find a way of explaining different things, new things, every single week. And the first news article for today is something that is very much outside of our wheelhouse. I'm considering just naming this segment Not in Our Wheelhouse. Whose job is it anyway? Which is our recurring segment, hopefully recurring segment on changes in the employability sector around, again, science, tech, and education. And this is relating to something that if you're in the United States, you lived through it. Thankfully, we didn't have to go through it. And that is, of course, the massive delays on the 11th of January in the number of flights within the United States. And I believe over 11,000 flights were delayed or cancelled, which is the largest number of flight cancellations since
That's huge.
9/11.
Since 9/11, okay.
And that is a really scary thing, because 9/11 was a terrorist attack, right? It was a real security threat upon a whole nation. What was the cause this time? It wasn't anything sinister to my mind, or at least it hasn't been released as being anything sinister. It's actually the boringest reason of all. It was a computer glitch.
Okay.
And if you read the article, it has the FAA outage. This is an article from Webb, lays bare an essential system everyone hates. And that system is called NOTAM, which stands for Notice to Air Missions. And straight away, half of our very small audience has already fallen asleep, because this is software and acronyms.
No what?
NOTAM. Oh, it all sounds very boring.
My understanding of it was it's essentially a ledger which details current flight conditions, any hazards that may be encountered by the pilots, and that it's released before flight. And then, they're going through it and checking that, everything's in order.
Okay, so I'm falling asleep.
That's my very vague.
I'm falling asleep already.
Very vague understanding of it.
Think about ledgers and things like such an archaic, boring thing led to such a dramatic impact on people's lives. That's a real disconnect that most people would have on this. It wasn't anything super sexy or super scary. It was just like a literal piece of software. First of all, let's talk about how important this piece of software is. it seems to be regulating all sorts of flights, not just commercial passenger flights, but it also affected military flights. So the military
okay.
also utilized the system to, I don't know, potentially regulate operations they're doing, hopefully not clandestine operations. Military flights were also affected by this outage. And again, not for a super scary or exciting reason. It came down to, as it turns out, one single data file. And
just one.
Just one data file. And I think it was one person's job to check that file, and they screwed up, or
wouldn't want to be that person right now.
That's right. And then it caused this 11,000 flight cancellation.
Is that something you put on your CV?
Well, it depends on how much you rescued that situation. So then you could claim to be the person who fixed it.
Responsible for 11,000 flights being grounded.
A leader and an innovator is what I would put on my CV if I was to own that. So before we
got a good spin. Okay.
Before we dive into the weeds of it, I guess, let's take a step back. Many people who may listen to us now or in the future could be young people looking for jobs and looking for new opportunities and dipping their toe into the workplace. What would be your response if, let's say, you were this person who made this screw up? Yeah. So how would you deal with this as a professional, as a seasoned veteran of your field? If you screwed up,
seasoned mistake maker.
Seasoned. You said it, not me. As someone who is a habitual mistake maker, not a habitual mistake maker. As someone who's,
a bit harsh,
like anyone, has made a mistake, how have you mitigated that and moved forward? Because you're still here, you're still gainfully employed. So you've clearly done something right, and myself as well, right? So we've all made mistakes professionally. What's the biggest mistake you've made in a professional workplace that you've bounced back from? We won't talk about the ones that you haven't bounced back from.
I could have been so much more successul.
That's right. What's the biggest mistake you made, and how did you bounce back from?
Within a lab environment, accidentally writing off something that's worth a good few $1,000s. It's not a great mistake to make, but my approach is always honesty. My boss knows I'm a very honest person. I always think it will come back to bite you at some stage if you're not honest about it. So fess up. I take the same approach when I have students that I'm training as well, or that I've been training in the past. And I say to them, you know what? You won't make the same mistake again. You will never make that same mistake again. I think I was unpacking something in dry ice. It comes as this box full of all of these pellets.
In a previous role?
In a previous role.
Not in your current role, yes.
No.
Just to be clear, in a previous
role. Huge box. It's packed to the brim with these little pellets of dry ice. You have to pack a lot in, like 20 kilos to transport it, to make sure it still stays frozen when it arrives. And so I just unpacked it. I had these boxes. It said item 1 of 3, 2 of 3, 3 of 3. And I went, great, okay, got it all out. Of course, I come back the next morning and go to throw out the box, and there's this item just sitting down the bottom of the box staring at me. I was a couple of days into the role at the time, so it was just really horrible.
How much would that item have been worth in your estimation? In US dollars?
In US dollars.
In US dollars.
US dollars.
In gold bullion.
$1 US in today's exchange rate.
In gold bullion.
A few thousand, probably.
A few thousand.
Maybe like $2,000, $3,000.
Okay, so way more than your weekly paycheck or fortnightly paycheck or monthly paycheck at that time. Right. So that would have been scary. Presumably you owned up to it to whoever the account holder was. And how was that received?
You know, my boss just sort of said, look, it's not great, but mistakes happen. I'm sure it won't happen again.
Yep.
And I said, no, definitely won't. I unpack dry ice bit by bit now. It's not a wonderful mistake to make, but a dishonest person probably could have just put that in the freezer.
Sure.
And pretended it was fine. And then someone would run an experiment and it wouldn't work.
When I was first starting out, I was doing experiments on cells. And part of the protocol, again, this gets really specific, but part of the process of that experiment involves starting out on ice. So you start the experiment by putting the cells on ice.
As you often do,
Put them in chill zone.
For some experiments.
And then, of course, eventually, to do any biological experiment, you got to replicate the environment that the biological organism lives in, and we don't live on ice. So eventually I was supposed to move the cells to an environment that was like 37 degrees Celsius, close to the body temperature. And I never read that far down, or I never realized that that was part of the expectations. So for 6 months, I was doing all of these experiments, using all of these cells, using all of these reagents, and way more than a few $1,000s worth of material. I was just doing everything on ice, and I wasn't seeing anything in the results. I was seeing changes, but they were just wild fluctuations. fluctuations that weren't repeatable. And then one day my immediate supervisor, can I just sit with you and watch you do it?
When they want to watch you do it step by step.
Do you mind if I just sit and watch you? Like, not that I don't trust you, but can I just watch you?
Students out there, if your supervisor asked to sit down with you and run something.
That's right. Can I just watch you do something?
Right. It's a very useful exercise.
Well, it turns out that's what I needed because, obviously
we've all been there.
This thing to the incubator to finish the last step. And I feel terrible. I still feel terrible about it to this day, not just because of the resources I wasted, but of the time that I wasted, because that was during the very formative years of my training. And
6 months is such a long time.
Every month is so valuable.
Yeah, in a PhD.
It took 6 months for me to do all these experiments the first time around incorrectly. But to repeat the same 6 months worth of experiments took me less than a month. So at the end of the day, if you are in a work environment that promotes professional development, the employee should be worth more than any one individual screw up. If, let's say, the screw up is focused on one item or a piece of equipment. If you work with a company for 5 or 10 years, not just the money that you're getting paid, but also the trust and the cost of replacing you, the cost of finding someone else and retraining, should be way more than any individual item. It's about your belief in that this is a learning experience, and hopefully your immediate supervisor will view it as a learning experience as well.
And, my approach, I think, is always to offer a solution at the same time as being the bearer of bad news. Here's what happened, but I've arranged this.
Right.
Here's some options.
Yep.
I think it's always a good way to approach things.
Oh, great. I'm going to paraphrase that HBO show Industry, which I'm a big fan of. It's all about the finance sector and young people trying to make it in Wall Street.
Yeah, I haven't watched it.
Okay. And there's this mentor there, and he tells his protege, there's 2 times to tell me about a screw up. First, when you F it up, or when you've un-effed it. So, so when you F up or when you un-effed it. So either you've made the screw up, you just own up to it, or you figured out a solution already. Hopefully there's not a huge lag between those 2 events. Hopefully you can figure out a solution quickly.
The shorter the better.
Everyone can bounce back from it. A single mistake does not define most people's careers, unless it's like criminal and fraud and all that kind of stuff, right? If it's just honest, procedural, incorrect, inaccuracies, we can bounce back. In this case...
Yeah, it wouldn't have been great if I made the same mistake a week later, which I didn't.
If I did experiments on ice for the rest of my career, then it's like, what's going on here? Do you have a thing
with... experiment specialist.
Do you have a thing with ice? What's going on?
Have you tried running that on ice?
Are you owned by Big Ice? Like, what's going on? So let's come back to the story here.
Sorry.
We're getting sidetracked. Do you think this contractor would have been able to bounce back? Because it was not according to all the reports, it was not a routine government employee.
Right.
Like many things with these big old pieces of software like NoTam, maintaining it over time is not one person's job. It can't be one person's job, right? If it's 30 years old, like very few people have careers in one location for 30 years.
With something this important, it's a problem that there's not more redundancy in the system, and it's come down to one person making this mistake. Whether that person becomes the fall guy or how much they were following protocol and procedure or not.
From my understanding, this is a third-party external vendor that's coming to do this government contract. Then
it bounce back. Probably yes.
Probably yes.
I wouldn't go bringing it up at work drinks or.
There could be a little too much transparency in this case.
There can be too much transparency.
In the public sphere. So let's dive into the weeds a bit more about the software of it, okay? And again, this is not in our wheelhouse. That's the subtitle of our whole podcast. But we do know, and we do work with software very routinely. Maintaining this piece of software is estimated to cost $29 million US. And also, it's not slated to be updated for another 6 years. So however they've worked out the accounting and the budget, they said, well, hey, it wasn't due to be updated anyway for another 6 years. And to do that, it will cost $30 million US roughly. And so they're trying to use this as incentive or motivation to say, hey, maybe we should be updating it before 6 years' time so we don't have this problem happen again. But they said, hey, it's an isolated incident. It's not a security risk. One person didn't follow procedure when they were managing this one single file. So not much redundancy. Doesn't sound like a great system. Sounds very old and very expensive. In our setting, and I'll start first this time, do we have experience with software that doesn't seem to do that much, but is very expensive and very old and just doesn't go away? Of course.
Yeah.
Within universities and colleges, we're all working with software that is either really wide scale and enterprise, so anything in the Microsoft Office suite or Office 365, OneDrive, all those kinds of things, Outlook. We use those things every day.
I mean, obviously, it would be a massive undertaking to try and change these systems, right? Which is why it doesn't happen.
No, and
more
Microsoft
frequently.
is known for just being reliable for a business, and you just have to adapt it for your workplace. So we, of course, are in that game in higher education, like everyone else in the world.
Yeah.
Has its flaws, but by and large, it's pretty okay, right?
Works.
Because if you have a problem, everyone in the world would be having that same problem.
That's right.
So the pressure is on to fix it. But then the other side of it is we've got all of these little pieces of software that at the time were cheaper to develop in-house. It was not feasible to go out there and find a company to do it for us.
Right. Okay.
Or no company out there was doing things at that low scale. So you couldn't find anyone anyway. It's not worth anyone's time. So we've got all of these isolated pieces of software that are very functional, but they haven't moved on. And we need to maintain them, right? And holding on to the past is a bad thing in many, many respects. But in software, it's particularly bad because there's all these security vulnerabilities that hackers can take advantage of. So all of these pieces of software that are super old and they still run and it costs a lot to maintain. And it's not because the people aren't good at maintaining it.
Yeah.
That figure of $30 million to maintain a piece of software. Does that sound reasonable to you given your knowledge of software in your sector?
Look, it's expensive, but yes, it's probably it's very feasible, I think.
It's sad, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we have pieces of equipment, critical scientific equipment. They're really critical to people's experiments. Often they have a protocol or a procedure that they have optimized for doing on that particular piece of equipment. Even though it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work well. While it's still being used, it needs to be maintained. That number is perfectly feasible, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, there's a market for it.
Yeah, software is one of these things where it's invisible. Like, what is it? Like, it's not tangible, but it's just never ending in terms of its utility and also its maintenance costs. And the one final example I'll bring to this is if you do anything creative, you probably need to use something in the Adobe Creative Cloud suite. Whether that be you're a photographer, you use Photoshop and Lightroom, or you're a video editor, you use Premiere Pro or Adobe Rush, or you're an illustrator and you want to use Adobe Illustrator or InDesign, all of these amazing suite of tools. And for the longest time, it was you pay a certain amount of money and you would own that piece of software, that version of it outright. So back in the day, you could buy Photoshop outright, cost you a couple of grand, but then you would have that piece of software and use it forever. But then Adobe shifted to the subscription-only model, which basically is a never-ending service contract, right?
Of course.
But the cost of it, they were able to bring down because so many people rely on their products. So I don't know what the current pricing is, but it's less than $100 a month on average, around that ballpark. So for an individual business, even a small business, that might be okay to stomach if you were creating money off the creative stuff that you were doing. Yeah, everyone hated it because most people who are photographers, like me, we don't make money from photography. We do it because we love to take photos and love to take videos.
It's a lot of money.
Having to pay rent on software.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
That feels terrible, but
Ages,
actually that's what needs to happen for it to be a living, breathing, functional product that doesn't have security risks and can service a lot of people. We do have to pay rent on software.
It's interesting you say that because my immediate impression is just always, it's a money grabbing exercise.
Yes.
But it's a very valid point. To keep it current and working, then often this is how it has to happen.
And the App Store, I roll my eyes again at an app that says, it's a monthly app fee. Or there's like in-app purchases, like, just make it free or give me a one-time fee.
Show me a lot of ads.
But the thing is, the app that you download that doesn't have that and is not maintained, is that going to be the thing that lets your phone get hacked? Because it's not getting maintained and it has the security vulnerability that everyone's trying to patch up. So that's the mentality shift in the sector.
Yeah, I can see that. Although I do still kind of feel like I'm going to pay $5. Don't show me any ads. Leave me alone.
So I think, let's say someone comes down and says, well, instead of NOTAM, we're going to release NOTAM Plus. So it'll be an ongoing subscription, just like Disney Plus. And then they guarantee...
Just like Disney Plus.
Disney Plus is not going great if they're going into this business and making NOTAM flight software.
You can listen to the guidelines in the voice of Mickey Mouse or something.
Well, that would be a coup if that was the case, but I don't think that's good for anyone involved in this. The development is baked into the fee. That $30 million is not just the next time we bother to look at the software,
but to maintain the system.
But it's like every month you get this. Maybe that's the model that it will move towards. That's certainly the model that the private sector has moved towards. But yeah, when you talk about government contracts and public sector and taxpayers' money, everyone's a little reluctant to say, hey, he's just a blank check we're writing this company for.
And what you don't want is, the company to come back and go, okay, we're absolutely being relied upon for this. Just keep increasing our prices.
Oh, Netflix keeps upping their price. That's exactly what they're going to do. What are you talking about?
Exactly what they're going to do. Yeah.
But then you're willing to pay the price if the service is so essential. So yeah, it's a chicken and egg. And again, this is clearly not our wheelhouse, but it is very interesting in how flights can be relevant to our situations as scientists and teachers and professors, because it all comes down to the tech and the software.
That's right.
It's all connected.
Probably put in a disclaimer that obviously these are our opinions and not the opinions of our employers.
I've recorded a bit now that we could put at the front of every episode. Right? The views shared in this episode do not reflect the views of our employers or even ourselves, really, most of the time. There's very much our own opinions. These are our own. From flights, domestic flights being grounded, all the way to space. Recently, the news headline around the James Webb telescope, which is a NASA endeavor by and large, is sending back these absolutely breathtaking images of what they call exoplanets. And I don't know if you've seen these images online, but it's just something that looks very much sci-fi and very much like it's a CGI render. Like, it looks so much like the movies that you don't realize these are actual images captured by a real thing, not something that's drawn by an artist. Right. The more I dug into the story, because I knew nothing about it, I just like to look at pretty images, right? The more I dug into it, the more I realized this is actually really interesting from a science and tech perspective. Do you know much about these telescopes? James Webb and the Hubble was the one previous to this.
Obviously heard about them, but don't know much about them.
Right. So the first thing is, of course, like how far into space it could project.
Okay.
Right? So that's one consideration. I don't know that much about light years and all that kind of stuff. I watch movies and I know a little bit about it, but I'm not a huge Trekkie or anything like that.
We stay within our biology realm.
That's right. We're in our lane. We look at very, very small things, not very, very big things.
That's
or things that are far away.
Small things.
But again, the more I investigate, the more parallels there are to our work. So that's the first consideration, right? So how far away the signal can transmit. But also when the signal comes back, how sensitive the telescope is at receiving that information.
Right, okay.
And what kind of information it can receive. And we very much have to worry about that in our work.
Yeah, a lot of parallels to microscopy, right?
That's right. So in our work, we look at very, very small things with microscopes. And it's not just the distance it travels, because it's a tiny thing, because the microscope is this close to the sample, really, really close. It's about what information can we actually gather from that sample. We have to do all sorts of tricks and loops to get any information back from a sample. Scatter electrons, we can label fluorescent things, we can just pass light through it, or we stain it with different colors, or we cut it into tiny thin sections. We've got all of these tricks just to get as much information from that sample as possible.
Very tiny, that's right.
And the issue with, it turns out, and really again, it's not in our wheelhouse, but the issue with traveling through light years worth of distance and time to get this image from interplanetary areas is that there's all of this dust.
Right.
And scattered light, as you can imagine, from all these stars.
Sounds like a microscopist's worst nightmare.
So it's all this optical nightmare, right? So when you design cameras, you want the lens and the sensor to be really close.
Yeah, so my concern with any dust in the way of our imaging. And,
if I get some dust on my glasses, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, me too.
Let alone something light years away.
That's right.
And so it's not just it can travel light years, it's that when you get it back, how clean is this image?
Right.
And it turns out that the thing that makes James Webb able to resolve such clear images is that the type of signal it can receive and is really sensitive to is in the infrared spectrum.
Okay.
We're not physicists, but we know a little bit about light pretty much, right? Light is measured essentially in wavelengths. There's different types of light. And most of the visible light that we see, we can measure within a pretty narrow band. Yeah, so that's pretty much 300 to about 700 nanometers. Or if you want to measure it in terms of microns, it's anywhere up to like 0.5, 0.6 micron. And a micron is 1 micrometer. So if you get a meter, if you can visualize a meter worth of distance, you divide that into a million bits, which you probably can't conceptualize. That's essentially how small a micron is. It's pretty much imperceptible to your physical eye. But if it's within that wavelength, you magnify big enough, you can see something, right? Because it's within a visible spectra. Anything higher than that and really lower than that too. But really higher than that, So UV is about like 200, 300 in that range. Anything higher than that, if you're talking about 0.7, 0.75, 1 micron, that's considered to be not visible spectra. But there's still information in those wavelengths. We just can't see it with our naked eye. And infrared belongs in that category. And so there's all this infrared information in all the light around us, but our eyes can't see it. But you know, I can see it, James Webb can. All the dust and all the light scattering that would happen through the coursing of information from space to the microscope, that is in the visible spectrum, which James Webb essentially has a filter, has an Instagram filter, applies to it, removes all that noise. And what's left is these amazing images that we see because they belong in the infrared spectrum. What's the parallel in our lab? Do we do much infrared work with microscopes?
Not that much. It can be done. It is used sometimes. My understanding is it's not super reliable, at least wasn't when I was last using it. But we prefer to work in the visible light spectrum so we can see what we're doing.
Of course.
For microscopy, at least. Maybe fluorescent cell sorting, another technique that scientists often do. They're not as concerned because they're not physically looking at the samples, but certainly in microscopy, Lexafluor 488, GFP is something that people may have heard of, fluorescent protein that was originally isolated from, I think it was from jellyfish.
Yes.
Is that right? So, you know, when it was first discovered, all this talk of glowing mice and labeling proteins, and you could see them fluoresce green.
yes, and that makes a lot of sense. Green is easier to see than red.
Yeah. But red is the next most common. So,
right. But if you had a choice, if you wanted the signal to be the easiest to visibly see, green is the way to go.
Green's the way to go.
But you can go, I guess, technically as close to that invisible spectral line as you can, I think.
Yeah, sometimes we work with fluorophore called far red. Some people can sort of see it a little bit.
Sure. Well, that's interesting you say that because I wonder how NASA is deciding where to direct James Webb and point it at.
Who knows?
Again, not our field. That's really interesting because if they rely on the infrared information to come back, they won't be able to see it in real time.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So,
well, I mean, none of it's real time.
Not our field,
but yeah. Well, none of it's in real time, but that does make their strategy for choosing which area to direct the telescope towards really interesting. They're applying a filter on the noise that's coming back and removing all the visible spectra, which is most of the dust that's clouding our vision of the planets, these exoplanets.
So they must have an area of interest they're looking at.
Must have an area of interest. There are all these before and after images that are on the NASA website that are found. Yet before it's just all of this.
This is very cool looking though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very extraneous signal on one hand was the visible light spectra. And then when you use the infrared information with the invisible spectra, then it just looks much cleaner, much crisper, much sharper. And the only parallel that I know to this, because again, this is not our field, I keep saying that, is within the field of infrared photography. Put infrared filter in front of your camera lens.
Okay.
And so all the things you're taking images of are just the things that are infrared signal information, right?
Have you ever tried it? Or?
No, I've never tried it. I'm really keen.
Very expensive to get an infrared filter? Or?
Well, it's not expensive to get just a filter because that's a really cheap way, right? It's a piece of glass, really, that blocks out all the non-infrared light. But that's most of the light out there. So
yeah, that's true. Okay.
Your images become really, really dark. Yeah. You have to compensate for that by all sorts of other tricks.
What's the workaround then to capture
So you can either basically just tell your camera to turn on for a very long time, so have a very slow shutter speed, getting as much of that information as possible.
Okay, right.
Or you can jack up the gain and make it really, really high ISO and you'd get some image. Alternatively, you could basically convert your whole camera sensor to only detect infrared information, which you can do. There are companies that do that. There's a lot of forensic applications for infrared photography because a lot of evidence is not visible within the visible spectrum.
Right, okay.
But if you image it with infrared, you can see the edges of the stain or something like that much clearer. So there are companies that do that, but it's a really expensive thing to do for a camera, for your new camera. Don't go and get your phone converted to infrared, I think. Maybe that's in the new iPhone. That's the shtick. Forensic people can just use the iPhone instead of converting cameras.
My mum's going to go, what did you do to my phone?
Everything's so dark and everything looks absolutely crazy because the photos look crazy from it. People look like ghosts. Like it's just having an ethereal quality. And if you image...
I give that vibe off anyway.
You give that vibe off. No, I'm filming you. For people who aren't watching this on the YouTube channel, this is a video podcast as well. So if you're interested in watching the video podcast, it's all live on the YouTube channel, Biolab Collective, but hopefully you're listening to audio version as well, or instead of. Either way is perfectly okay with us. And you can find the audio version of the podcast on all the big podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, or your podcast player of choice. Now, coming back to the idea of innovation in telescopes and the fact that James Webb is building upon the work of Hubble and becoming much more sophisticated within our field of microscopy, what is the innovation being?
Seeing more and more detail.
More detail, right? So resolution, that's really common in
Resolution,
photography as well.
definitely. Also cost, I guess.
Cost as well,
Yeah.
More resolution or scanning speed going quicker, and that's really important.
Speed as well, yeah, of course.
Really important if you're scanning
If you
living
can high
cells.
throughput something.
That's
yeah.
right. You're either looking at a cell that's moving or looking at lots and lots of cells, then you don't want to use one microscope to image 100
because
samples.
it can be laborious. I mean, it takes a long time to image something. So the more you can automate, the better.
And we talked about automation in episode 1 of the podcast last week. Now, the other part of it, as you said, is cost, right?
Yes.
And the idea of trying to make that cost, well, it can go either way. Generally speaking, it's trying to massify and make it scalable and bring the cost per instrument down to an extent. And this is an article from Nature, which showcased the latest mini microscope, which has pretty good performance. It's certainly performance to cost ratio is through the roof because it's estimated the cost per unit $4 because a large part of it is 3D printed.
That's now 500 Australian dollars.
Or one gold bullion. I don't know. We don't know how current
I don't know why we keep talking about exchange rates.
It's just a bad time to be an Australian.
Had some bad online shopping experiences.
Yeah, it's just not in our favor for the foreseeable future. Actually, nothing against the US dollar is particularly favorable right now as of 2023.
Again, back to the I'm not an economist disclaimer.
We're not economists.
It seems like when the economy is in trouble, everyone invests in the US dollar. And when the US is in trouble, everyone invests in the US dollar.
Well, the funny thing is we talked about how scientists, we have to be very careful in not saying the wrong thing because then we'll get blamed for it. Economists don't have that fear at all. They're constantly making these super bold predictions about the next 20 years of financial forecasts and whether there's definitely a recession and when it's coming. They are right most of the time, I think, but so are scientists. It just takes one mistake and we're doomed. But
we're discredited forever.
We need to learn more from economists in some ways.
That's true.
In some ways. Not the ones that go to jail, but we need to learn more.
Economists, teach us your tricks.
Please. Let us know how to be more effective communicators that don't get in our own ways. So this mini microscope is amazing because it's 3D printed, it's super cheap. And this is a real dilemma that I'm in all the time personally because people come to me and ask about how to get their kids involved in science. It's really exciting. My son, my daughter, my child wants to learn more about science and they want to see the natural world. So they want a microscope. And these microscopes, all of them are pretty good.
Yep.
But the cost of entry for someone who's casually interested in it, I would say is maybe not really worth it if it's the first time around.
Okay.
Like, will you be able to tell the difference between a $500 versus the $1,000 microscope when you're first starting out? Of course not. In fact, all you'll probably see,
money to spend.
All you'll probably see is just your eyelashes when you're starting because you just don't know how to use it, engage it. Like
always,
it's just get the cheapest thing. But the thing is, the cheapest thing is still a few $100s, and
that would be more around the amount I would be willing to spend.
but that's still not a small investment, right? And if it's so much, I'm very cautious about telling parents to spend a couple $100 to instill an interest in science because so much of it is available free, right?
Yes.
Now, this isn't free, but $4 gets pretty close. It's pretty close, right? It's like a decent, it's not a decent meal. It's a cheap meal, right? Depending on the economy. It's a
cheap meal these days.
Average to above average
like
meal for a kid.
Coffee price.
Coffee, let's say.
Yes.
Yeah, coffee. A carton of milk, a pint of milk. This is very approachable. I could recommend this and say, hey, you could just start with this. And if your kid really likes it, you want greater resolving power or greater resolution or infrared signals, then you can kind of invest in more things. But this is a really easy way. I think that's a great direction everything's moving in.
Very cool. I mean, can you imagine if you're in school and you do a project where you piece together a 3D printed microscope? How cool of a project is that?
You're asked to make your own microscope at school and you can have something that actually works, not just something janky.
Not made out of toilet rolls.
is that a common schematic toilet roll microscope? I'm not really sure.
My daughter's favorite telescope.
Your daughter's favorite telescope is made out of toilet rolls. Okay. Not quite relatable, maybe, but let us know if your kids also use toilet rolls in creative ways.
Please tell us in the comments below.
From space and looking at space images to something that is quite crazy, something that I didn't know about at all. And it's basically this term called space debris or space junk. And it's not debris in terms of loose asteroids or meteors or planetary waste. It's junk that humans have created and brought up there. And this article is a little bit old now. It's from The Conversation, but it basically is how it cottoned onto this before finding another Washington Post article, which made a space junk into like an old school Space Invaders game, and you have to like move a spaceship and shoot the junk. Anyway, it's cool. I'll send you the link. It's really cool.
That sounds super fun.
That's their hook, right? To talk about this really serious issue of space junk to make it into a Space Invaders game. Mars is littered with over 15,000 pounds, which is over 7,000 kilograms of human trash from 50 years of robotic exploration. This is Mars alone, right? Just Mars, the place that we want to go live at eventually, if you believe everyone who's working on these Mars missions. We've already dumped this much trash there.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So
that's shocking.
When I tell you this, what's the first question that comes to mind when I tell you, hey, there's like this much trash on Mars? What would you want to know?
What do you do with trash?
What do you do with trash?
Yeah, what do you do with trash when it's produced?
Okay, so before we get there, let's talk about what kind of trash it is. Is it like Mars bar wrappers? Is it like what kind of trash are we talking about? Like,
Who goes to Mars and eats a Mars bar?
It's a bit on the nose, isn't it?
It's very on the nose.
It's a bit on the nose. Mars bar. A little too on the nose. But maybe robots are not without their irony, right? Maybe the automation thought this is a good idea, the algorithm.
What's the Explorer picked up now? Oh, it's a Mars bar wrapper.
The thing is, I would love to say that was like a witty pun that I planned out. Just that was the first thing that came to mind.
Are you a Mars bar fan? Or?
I did like them, but I felt terrible after eating it. I
prefer Snickers.
Snickers is a more substantial thing. We're not sponsored by either one.
No,
not sponsored by either
this is clearly not a sponsored podcast.
No, and I've been sugar free for 4 months, and I'm hating every second of it. But I'm sugar free, so
there are no Mars bars or Snickers in Jack's future.
No, none at all, none at all. Okay, so what kind of trash are we talking about? So
what kind of trash?
Not everyday trash. Thankfully, I think, right? Because it's not like cans and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So if you read the article, it's inactive spacecrafts, aluminium wheels, screws and drill bits.
Oh, drill bits.
Right, so it's like mechanical things. Like it's things that you would use to build the spacecraft or maintain it.
Yeah.
And the return trip, if there were any people involved in any space mission, you always want to like shed weight. So I don't know if you see any of the space movies like Apollo 13 or Interstellar or anything like that.
Bits are coming off.
It's like a little explosion and a bit falls off, and then they keep going because they want to reduce weight as they move to be even more agile and hopefully use the Earth or the moon's orbit to kind of leverage that force. All of this stuff, every time a little canister of fuel is kind of dropped off or rockets kind of fire, that doesn't just go away. That sticks around, that hangs around. So the first question is, does it matter? Does it matter if all of this space trash is out there floating around?
I'm guessing it's dangerous to other equipment, right? If it's just floating around or propelling through space.
All right, so if we assume that there's no life form out there, no extraterrestrial life that can be damaged by this, which is a huge if, but so far we haven't found obvious evidence that there is extraterrestrial life forms out there. The fact that just having all this trash floating out there without anyone being affected by it, in theory, sounds okay. But you've raised the right point that we have a vested interest, right? So we are putting things into space that aren't junk.
Of course.
So satellites, everything that beams signals for cell phones, for our military communications, for our cell towers, all that kind of stuff, that is reliant on pretty much having an unperturbed path of these satellites. And that once you send a satellite into space, which is not a cheap thing, it stays damage free. But this space junk is now becoming an issue of our own making, in that these are pretty small things. Like a little drill bit could be like 10 centimeters, but it's damaging satellites. It's also damaging. James Webb has been damaged in a small portion by this space debris, as has Hubble, because of course if it's floating out there, if it enters the Earth's orbit, for instance, that would be something that directly comes into contact with satellites that are in the Earth's orbit as well. It is traveling at a speed where it doesn't have to be an asteroid or a meteor to...
Right, it's still dangerous.
It's still dangerous. Without knowing anything about it, what do you think would be a strategy that we could use to rope it back or clean the trash out?
A giant magnet.
A giant magnet. That sounds like Dr. Evil from Austin Powers. Well, you're not that far off, because the first thing, a giant magnet. Is that the only answer?
Some way to collect it. Right. Okay. Or at least combine it together so it's less of a...
So this is why...
If you can't bring it back, then bring it together so it can be traced, or at least...
Right, organize the clutter before you decide. At least it's neat.
That's how I clean my house. The basket method.
a giant bin that everything goes towards, but you just leave the bin in space.
I mean, it'd be great if you could bring it back, but
So researching this
might be.
article has made doing this whole podcast worthwhile for me. That's enough to validate, because it's super interesting reading about this, right?
You're making less stupid comments than I am.
Okay, well, hopefully as you read more, you'll feel less stupid. But I think it's all valid. These are questions
Okay,
people
the
are
giant
asking.
magnet.
The first fact that we need to get out there is that, to my understanding, currently not a single piece of space trash has ever been successfully retrieved from space.
It's terrible.
So any idea is a good idea at this point, because
okay.
we've not been successful at all, right?
Someone out there is going, why didn't we think of a giant magnet?
Well, okay, so
Genius.
no, the giant magnet is one thing. I don't know how giant they're talking, but
Probably
generally
not metal,
magnetic
but,
coils is one proposed solution.
Oh, right. Okay, it is
Yes,
a thing. Okay.
But again, to date, not a single piece of space trash in orbit has been removed. And we're talking about estimating 500,000 objects between 1 and 10 centimeters of space trash are orbiting Earth right now. So this is something that we do need to think about long term, because it's not going to be 500,000 in 10 years' time. Now, the next strategy is something that I know won't work. Again, not my wheelhouse, but they've called it the chaser satellite method. They send a satellite in to chase the space trash and hopefully approximate its speed and catch up to it.
Right.
And then through magnetic coils or otherwise subsume that piece of trash.
Okay.
But then what happens to that satellite? Does that then become a piece of trash in space as well? Like, what happens to that?
Yeah, it becomes its own piece of trash.
Yeah, so I've actually called this the cane toad method, where to get rid of pests, we introduced cane toads in Australia. And now cane toads are universally reviled as the worst pest in all of Australia. It's way worse than the original pest. I don't even know what the original pest.
Some kind of beetle, wasn't it?
Was it? Okay, it doesn't matter.
I feel like it was some kind of pest on sugarcane.
Okay, but now cane toads are way worse of a problem, specifically in Australia. They're everywhere. We literally have lots and lots of classes where the whole class is a lab tech going out there and collecting dozens of the hundreds of cane toads and taking them back to do experiments. Sorry if you're a cane toad activist.
Many of them around.
You never know. Apologies
if
you're a
cane toad dissection in high school.
Exactly. So it's to that point where high schools are very okay just collecting hundreds and thousands of cane toads to do experiments on, because there's that big a pest. You don't want the satellite to then become the cane toad, right? Then if you don't want to send a chaser satellite to chase down the original chaser satellite. That kind of has that kind of vibe to it, doesn't it?
It's a stretch. Any non-Australian listeners, the cane toad doesn't have a predator.
Yeah, so
it's part of the problem.
Part of the problem. And frogs look kind of cute if they're the right color, but cane toads.
These are ugly creatures.
Well, beauty is the eye of the beholder, but to most people and everyone I know, they think of cane toads as pretty ugly looking. So
have you seen the stories where the dogs like lick the poison glands on the?
Yes. So the cane toads also, on top of its extra charms, it has poisonous glands on its back. Dogs and pets, unassuming pets, go around and try and eat cane toads or think it's food.
It's very dangerous for them, but some of them have learnt to sort of just get a little bit of a high from it.
Dogs?
Yeah.
Oh.
Some dogs. And this should have been the news article that we covered. They just taken a little bit of the poison and then they're sort of passed out.
Get a high?
Lying. Yeah, they get high from it.
Goodness.
Yeah, it's a thing.
There are better ways to spend your time. Maybe not. Maybe we should try it.
Next week's podcast.
For our 100th episode, we will bring in a cane toad live in studio.
Cane toad special. Don't offer that.
And the very last strategy they've offered, and again, I repeat, not a single piece of space trash in orbit has yet been successfully removed from space, is a giant laser, which is not that far away from your Dr. Evil solution. Giant magnets, giant lasers, all in the realm of science fiction, right? But it's a huge problem that not everyone is talking about, and it's getting worse because 2 years ago, in 2021, apparently there was a defunct satellite that was Russian, and Russia just basically blew it up.
Oh, right. Okay.
They didn't try and decommission it, they just blew it up. And they did decommission it very brutally.
That involves a service contract, Jack.
That's a never-ending service contract.
They were not willing to pay.
They were not willing to pay, and now there's all
so
this.
So they took the blow-it-up method.
Given that, again, not a single piece of space trash to date has been removed from space, but it's just kind of out of sight, out of mind, right? Who would have thought that?
Yeah, it's terrible. We've got a trash problem on Earth and in space as well.
I'm by no means an environmentalist to anywhere near the level that I think I need to be. I'm conscious of recycling, but beyond that, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing within my immediate sphere to kind of think about environmentally friendly practices.
It can be hard to know.
Climate change is a real thing, and very extreme weather events are happening more and more. In Australia, we've always had extreme weather events, and it's kind of part of our national identity in many ways. And many of the old school poems are all about the hottest of summers and the driest of heat waves, and
they're becoming more frequent.
And so whenever I see news articles about different ways of coming at this problem,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of it is just trying to communicate the severity of the issue or trying to talk about
Mm-hmm.
climate change to make sure that people know it's real, which is a really difficult challenge.
Yeah, it's hard.
Partly because it wasn't called climate change originally, it was called global warming. Extreme weather goes either way, right?
That's
you can go
right.
really
That's
warm or really cold, and when it's freezing and you're getting freezing blizzards, you're thinking
It doesn't feel very warm to me. Yeah.
it's really a science communication problem.
Well, it is. It's a massive science communication.
So whenever I see a slightly different approach on it, I really pay attention. And that's what the next article, which is the last article we'll talk about today, which is our crossover of the week, which is all about what France is doing, or a coalition of scientists in France behind a program called Atlas-C, which is conducted by the French National Center for Scientific Research and the French Atomic Energy Commission. Two numbers here I'll give you. 70 million genes.
Right.
They're going to map 70 million genes of underwater species to try and help protect all the vast sea life. And by sequencing that many genes, they will know, first of all, what lives in that sea.
Right.
Because most of the life that you can visibly see is an analogy or metaphor to the visible spectra that we talked about before with infrared. Most of life you can't actually see. It's microscopic.
Yeah.
So if you just say, oh, well, there's this many fish and this many things, you're very, very vastly underestimating all the diversity of life within an ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And you can't just put those things back and it's going to fix itself. Okay, so within my area of microbiology, there is this whole field that's been pushed for really aggressively in the last 20 years, which is using what we call culture independent techniques. In the past, unless it grew little spots on a plate or as a bit of fungus on a piece of toast, we didn't know that the microbe was there. But now we're doing DNA sequencing, just like this project here. And if this DNA sequence pinpoints the organism being present, then we know it's present. We can estimate how much of it is present there. All right. So they're doing this to catalog all of the things living within its immediate aquatic environments. They've advertised it as having a project to categorize 70 million genes. And the second number I'll give you is 41 million euro is the amount of funding this agency has received. Okay. So 41 million euro to sequence 70 million genes. What are your first impressions?
Oh, I think it sounds like a great initiative. I mean, to really use up-to-date science to tackle a problem like this, I think that's great. 41 million euros seems like a lot of money, but when it comes to the breadth and the scope of this project, I don't think it's actually that much. What do you think?
Well, the only way I can make sense of money, because again, we're coming from a very poor Australian dollar exchange rate currently. So I have no idea what 41 million euro is right now.
Where the exchange rate theme came from.
So the only thing I can compare it to is previous scientific endeavors of somewhat of a comparable scale. And the most famous one is the Human Genome Project.
Right.
But the official project's cost $2.7 billion.
Right. Okay.
And that was to sequence one single genome. So a genome is an organism's entire DNA blueprint. Every single DNA base pair it has within its cells. So that one human genome, which wasn't just one person's genome, it was like a composite of many different people's DNA, was 2.7 billion. Now they're claiming to be able to sequence all of these aquatic organisms' genomes, which presumably aren't human. They're proposing to sequence all of that for 41 million euro, which my math isn't great, but that's a fraction of 2.7 billion. How's that come about?
Cost has come down. So we've been talking about technology improving and things being scalable, able to be done faster, more efficiently. That's, for a long time, people have been talking about this sub $1,000 genome sequencing. And yeah, I'm not sure what current going cost is. Costs have definitely come down, meaning the scale of this project a lot cheaper to run.
Can be doable. And if you read into how they've been able to achieve this and bring the cost of sequencing down, it's really fascinating because it comes down to a technological problem, not so much a biological problem in some ways, right?
In some ways. Yeah, that's right.
So the tech behind it is...
The biology is the same.
It's very much the same principles as used in semiconductor technology and microchips and trying to...
That's right. Your laptop becomes smaller. Yeah.
Trying to make more things happen at the same time. There are tens of billions of those same things happening at the same time within that same thing, so that everything is just that much more efficient. It's working in parallel. These next-gen DNA sequencing platforms, which is not what was done in the original Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project pretty much used Sanger sequencing through and through. How many bases can a Sanger sequencing reaction go through and do?
About 500 to to 700.
Yeah, if you're optimistic, right? So
Yeah.
so I guess if you run both the
Sometimes a
forward,
bit more.
if you do 2 reactions at once, forward and reverse, you might
Yeah.
be able to get like a 1,000 base pairs, right?
Yeah.
Kilobase at the same time. Now, the next gen sequencing reactions, it's still about that for one single reaction, right? It's not like that much more, that much less, but it's just that it can do so many of those reactions at the same time. So the cost of it has come down a lot. So technologically speaking, 41 million euro to sequence 70 million genes is doable. Depends, though. My follow-up question would be which genes, right?
Yeah, I'm curious to know.
So we can classify organisms down to different levels of specificity.
That's correct, yes.
And if we say humans, Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus, and sapiens is the species.
That's correct, yeah.
That is actually not that informative anymore because, especially in my area of microbes, we go beyond the species level.
Right,
So
okay.
COVID now is in variants, right? Subvariants. So the species is not enough anymore, right? But if we were to do it to the genus level, we just have to sequence one single gene, the
Right,
16S rRNA gene, it's a ribosomal
okay.
RNA gene. So that's actually really easy to massify because you just need to look at one single big gene and that's got enough information to tell us what it is.
Yeah.
And there's an enormous database of these gene sequences and it's really easy to look up, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's pushed a lot of the work in my field forward, this kind of advance. In this case, that doesn't sound like that's what they're doing. It sounds like they're sequencing the whole genome.
It sounds like that, yeah.
Because
I guess then you would start by looking at a subset of genes. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I'm guessing there would be a subset that you would initially look at.
Yep.
And then branch out from there.
The other part of this project is not just we want to know what's there, let's catalog everything that's there right now, and monitor its progress over time to see how it's shifted.
Right, because they talk about diversity within the species, right?
That's right, and check the evolution and evolutionary pressures over time. And to do that, you probably can't just do one gene. Although within microbes, you kind of can, right? Because within microbes,
Which
that's
is great.
it's RNA.
Yeah,
you kind of have a
works
lot
really well
more
for your
insight
field.
than you would think.
But yeah, I guess first of all, they need to identify everything there, don't they?
Yes.
And then from there, they need to look at diversity within the gene subset once they make those identifications. So they have to catalog everything first, it sounds like, and then go from there and look at diversity.
Yes.
With the idea being that a population that has more diversity in the genome is less prone to or less susceptible to extinction, right?
Yes, yes. If we knew what lived in certain ecosystems, if there was some kind of, heaven forbid, a natural disaster of some sort, and they had to restore the ecosystem in some way, help it recover in some way, this would give you much more information to be able to do that because the things they're identifying, presumably that's not the only location in the world that these organisms are living in, right? So they can go in there and try and recreate that ecosystem or do a lot of interesting experiments to maybe recreate that ecosystem in vitro in some kind of contained environment.
And you always think that tiny little microbe doesn't affect you until it does in some obscure way, right?
Until it does. So let's think about this in a reverse direction. So if we say 41 million euro compared to 2.7 billion sounds like a good deal, does 41 million sound like it's not enough?
Yeah, sometimes I think that doesn't sound like enough.
Let's acknowledge that it is a lot of money, right? 41 million euro. And
of course.
And whenever you see press releases of these projects, it sounds like an obscene amount of money.
Yeah, sounds like a lot. And someone will go, oh, why are you investing in that?
How come you haven't done this already or made this breakthrough, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah.
Because the pace of innovation is very slow and unpredictable.
Science is expensive.
And in our area, most of that money goes towards really fancy equipment and machines that push against the limit of resolution or information, not towards scientists. Like the scientist's salary is laughable relative to the...
Spoiler alert, we don't get paid that much.
Depending on the country as well.
Scientists,
Yeah, depending on the country. So
in Australia, we get paid very well compared to other countries. So.
Yeah, the asterisk is compared to other countries.
Compared to other countries.
Compared to the amount of work that we have to do and the amount of thinking we have to do. Yeah, it's not like I can retire at 30 kind of money, by no means, right? It's not a small amount of money, but is it underestimating the cost? That's what I read this and I think, is it underestimating how much it's going to cost and what are going to be the knock-on effects of that long term?
I mean, thinking about a research grant maybe being in the realm of, say, a few $100,000, a few years project, 41 million doesn't seem like a huge amount of money.
Which, if we take a full circle in our crossover of the week, will the life of this project live beyond this 41 million euro? Because it kind of has to, for it to actually have any impact, it needs to, funding will stop, but its findings will live on.
It needs to keep going on, doesn't it?
That's right. So what would it look like, I guess? So it could get put into some kind of database.
And then maybe a sampling occurs.
Yep, that's right.
every certain number of years to then study the changes that have occurred.
Who stores these samples? Like if it's actual real samples they're collecting, what responsibility do they have to keep
Right,
this alive?
course.
You know, like frozen or in storage or something like
Yeah.
what is that? And much like the service contract discussion we're having with software, if you don't factor it into your budget, then one day it's going to all come crashing down.
Yeah.
Right? One day you're not going to have enough wherewithal to go in there and fix that problem because you've just neglected this enormous set of data for so long. You thought once you collected it, that was it. And this is an issue that came up in the news recently where biologists became laughing stocks, right? Because of this issue, because it comes back to how we think about and use very, very simple software tools. In this case, that tool is Microsoft Excel. And so this is the headline. Autocorrect errors in Excel still creating genomics headache. And that is a very, very mild understatement for the extent of the problem.
Headache is not descriptive enough.
When we report on genes, we use gene names. We don't say the full name of the gene. It has an abbreviated form of some sort.
So for those listeners who aren't sort of in the field, then each gene has an identifier and we use that to talk about the gene.
That's right. And the person who made that initial discovery of the gene usually has naming rights to it.
That's correct.
But that doesn't mean that that name will stick.
And there's some crazy gene names out there as well, aren't there?
Yeah. So the one, the Sonic Hedgehog is one that always comes to mind.
Sonic Hedgehog always comes to mind.
Whoever that intellectual, that highly educated intellectual was, they've got naming rights to it. And people kind of roll with it until it's discovered by someone else with more pull in the field, and maybe they might rename it.
I've actually had this issue personally where, a competitor in the field sort of renamed the gene.
Oh. And did that stick? Is that the gene name?
It stuck for a while.
And then
Hugo had to step in.
So Hugo's a conglomerate trying to standardize
the naming system because actually it's a huge problem. These genes, these proteins, the outcome of the genes biologically, they can have different names. So to find literature and what you're working on, you might have certain reagents within the lab and they're labeled according to one name that it's given, and then you don't realize because it's got these other names, and it gets very confusing. When I was working on this protein, it had about 5 different names. I went and I spoke to someone at a conference. I told them what I worked on, and they didn't even realize that we were working on the same protein because they called it something completely different.
Okay, so that's one obvious issue. That's a nightmare for search engine optimization, let alone just being able to find.
That's true. Yeah.
Know what you're talking about. The naming of some of these genes also is very tricky to manage in software. We're not using super fancy software to catalog this amazing information, right? We're using like freely available tools that our institutions give us access to. So in this case, it's Microsoft Excel. If it was a custom genomics browser with very, very tailored things, and that makes a lot of sense, right?
Well, most of us aren't bioinformaticians.
Excel was changing the gene names without anyone knowing.
Right, okay.
Are ones that look suspiciously like prompts for Excel to autocorrect. No. And the 2 examples they're given here, March 1.
Right, okay.
Of course, looks like the 1st of March, right? And the gene Sept4 looks like the 4th of September. So it gets renamed to dates.
It's terrible.
And if you were then saying filtering, because of course there would be gene entries with a field that has dates in it, right?
Yeah.
You got the date of curation, data was added to the database, and you sorted by date, or you sorted by a different parameter. It's just huge chaos.
Yeah, you might go, I mean, these are huge amounts of information. Often, in this case, it'll be a database or, an attachment onto a publication where they've made certain identifications and they've published them, and the attachment is an Excel spreadsheet.
Yes.
You go through and you say, oh, okay, this is very interesting. Is my particular protein or my particular gene of interest involved? And you do a search for it because you're not going to go combing through it. So you do a search and you may not find what you're looking for because it's been changed.
And the statistics on this was an article a little while ago, but pretty much said that it was hundreds of publications.
Yep, okay.
Like a couple of hundred.
Yeah, right.
Are reporting incorrect gene names.
Yeah, it's pretty
which
terrible,
is terrible.
isn't it? Yeah,
which is absolutely terrible. And hopefully this is an issue that we can hope to rectify through initiatives like Hugo. But again, all it takes is a new gene to be discovered.
Yeah.
And how that's regulated is pretty unclear. Hopefully Hugo has some more standardized ideas about that.
Again, it's a guideline that they're publishing. You should try and adhere to it, but I'm not sure how rigorous journals are with making sure you're adhering to it. I don't know.
And these are the indirect costs
Yeah.
that are not factored into those 41 million euro funding
Yeah.
announcements.
Yeah.
It's sustaining the project
That's right.
beyond its initial lifespan. Like this all takes time to figure out.
Yeah.
Like someone figured this out and had to go in and fix it.
Yeah,
you know?
it's awful, isn't it?
Probably for free. And so these are the indirect things that keep coming up throughout the lifespan of any kind of work you do. There's always unexpected costs and unexpected ways of managing it. And the more we see these problems occurring again and again, the more systematic we have to think at the inception of the project to mitigate those issues long term. And that's what I'm trying to think about more and more in my work. How do I make the things I'm doing live on beyond my sphere of influence right now? How do I make an idea stick that other people want to take it on and run with it? And in my area, it's teaching. You know, how do I design a kind of class that has lots of potential for people to teach in very similar ways as me and to have all the essence of what I'm trying to get across without it having to be me? You know, it's a really interesting idea, and it's something that doesn't have obvious solutions, but you can see it affects every single aspect of everything we talked about today, right? It's really, really interesting. And on that note, that's the conclusion of all the articles we had today. I don't think a single article today we mentioned was actually within either of our wheelhouses, right? Hopefully it's still an interesting exercise for you, because it's certainly interesting for me. I found and learned so much from it.
Yeah, me too.
If you're listening to this on one of your favorite podcast platforms, please know that there are other podcast platforms you can find us on, all the big ones: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and also we are filming everything for YouTube, so you can watch the full episode on YouTube as well. This is Crossover Connections. I'm Jack.
And I'm Amanda.
Thank you for watching and listening. We'll hopefully connect with you next time around.